When you hear the name Stephen of Blois, your first thought will likely turn to the King of England who stole the crown from the clutches of his cousin, the Empress Matilda. However, on this occasion, we are not referring to King Stephen, but instead to his father, the Count of Blois, of the same name. Count Stephen's wife was Adela, a daughter of William the Conqueror, a woman who would show her forceful nature when her husband attempted to abandon the First Crusade, the great Christian military venture of the 1090s that Stephen was one of the leaders of. Throughout the crusading era in the Holy Land, these expeditions would prove to be unbearably hard for many. There was, of course, the ever present threat of hostile enemies, but frequently the chief enemy for the Crusaders was less the swords wielded by Muslim armies marching against them, but rather the terrible summer heat which destroyed many of the Crusaders, who were not all just fighting men, but also female and male pilgrims, young and old alike, who had also made the long distance journey to the Holy Land, hoping to follow in the footsteps of Christ. Albert of Aachen says of the dreadful dehydration that afflicted almost all of the Christians on this expedition. Very many pregnant women, their throats dried up, their wombs withered, and all the veins of the body drained by the indescribable heat of the sun, and that parched region, gave birth and abandoned their young in the middle of the highway, in the view of everyone. Many men, falling with the exertion and the heat, gaping with open mouths and throats, were trying to catch the thinnest mist to cure their thirst. It could not help them at all. Pope Urban II had warned the Crusaders of the terrible conditions that they would face, but the religious devotion overcame all doubts for most of the Crusaders. However, even for the most battle-hardened of warriors in the Crusader army, never mind the pregnant women, the conditions were often unspeakable for a people who were accustomed to the more serene climates of northern Europe. So when Stephen began to doubt his future on the crusade, you could easily understand why. But those doubts had either not yet entered Stephen's mind in late March 1098, when the Crusader army was at Antioch, or else he was doing his level best to suppress them. He wrote once more to Adela, his words seemingly enthusiastic. Know for certain, my love, that I now have twice the amount of gold, silver, and many other riches as your loving heart would have given to me when I departed from you. Of course, for the Crusaders, the thoughts of fighting for Christ wasn't the only motivation in this war. As Stephen's words belie, there was plenty of opportunity to add wealth to one's pockets, and certainly many were tempted to take the risk of joining the crusade by the promises of such wealth, even if the chances of not returning home were all too high. But opportunities for more gold, silver, and the possibilities of enhancing himself as a true Christian hero were not enough for Stephen. As the grip of the terrible summer heat began to set in again, it was clear that the Count was unhappy, and so, feigning illness and fearing the approach of a relieving Turkish army, Stephen withdrew from Antioch to Alexandretta, unable to muster the stomach for the fight any longer. A day later, Antioch would fall into the Crusaders' possession in Stephen's absence. During his shameful flight, Stephen and his men happened to run into the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had, by writing to the Pope, initiated the crusade in the first place. The Christians at Antioch, Stephen told the emperor, although they had taken the city, were now under heavy siege and were now likely dead. Stephen told Alexios that the emperor would be better served returning to his capital at Constantinople. But despite Stephen's prophecy of doom, however, the Crusaders would not only hold Antioch, but they would go on to make even greater capture, that of the holy city itself, Jerusalem. Stephen's reputation had been tarnished, with one chronicler calling him foolish. In the midst of the hardships being suffered by his fellow Crusaders, Stephen's retreat looked cowardly, and would only be exacerbated by the Crusaders' accomplishments in his absence. Orderic Vitalis relates the reception that Stephen received when he returned to France. Stephen was despised and shamed by almost everyone. He was so often reproached by so many that he was forced to return to Christ's army. Chief among those who urged Stephen to return and fulfill the vows he had left incomplete was his wife. Adela, however, was not as harsh as Stephen's fellow nobles, but instead chose well-selected words, beseeching her husband to return to the east and restore his damaged reputation. There was, however, little doubt that Stephen was afraid to return, remembering all too well the terrible hardships of life on Crusade. It was easy for those who had remained in the West, and amongst the familiarities of home, to chastise him. But eventually, Stephen, likely listening to Adela more than anybody else, returned east. For the Crusaders, capturing Jerusalem was one thing, and establishing a lasting Christian presence in the Holy Land quite another. There would be hardships in the years to come for the Crusader states. By 1102, Stephen was ready to return home once again, but he was thwarted by bad weather, forcing him to return to Jaffa. Stephen would then support King Baldwin I of Jerusalem at the Battle of Ramla, but was taken prisoner and executed. Stephen died a wise and noble man, with his reputation seemingly restored, no longer remembered only for his foolish retreat from Antioch. Certainly Stephen's esteem had been restored in the eyes of his wife. Writing 2 years after his death, Adela referred to herself as the dearest wife of Count Stephen. It is very easy to judge Stephen, not least centuries later, and in the comforts of modern life. Stephen was no coward, and he was clearly held in high regard before his desertion at Antioch. He had been made, by his fellow Crusaders, one of the chief commanders at the siege of Antioch, but, in his own words, it had come against his will. Under the physical strain of Crusader life and the pressures of expectation to take charge of an army, Stephen's will had simply cracked.